Thank you for that, Mehdi. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. Can you all hear me okay? Great. Well, as Mehdi said, I graduated from here. It was 1999, so almost 20 years ago this June will mark 20 years, and it's just a real thrill to be back here. My dad graduated from here in 1974, and I ended up here not because of that, but that's just the way it went. We want to have as interactive a session as we can. Time is relatively short. We have a rather ambitious set of content that we want to get through. But by all means, if you have questions, a term we're using or what do we mean or something you'd like to interject, by all means, Les and I welcome that. And just by a show of hands, before we really jump into anything, could you let us know if you've been exposed to water issues, whether growing up on a farm or having a friend or a family member that's worked at the water district, or environmental interests with habitat preservation. So hands, who's been around? Okay, good. Because part of what we're trying to do is strike a balance of providing some contextual information for background as well as some pretty specific, complex subject matter. And so we're just trying to strike that balance. So again, we might need to speed up or slow down, and we'll certainly welcome input from you to help control that pace. So for a little bit of a background, Mehdi gave a nice description about some history. I want to fill in a little bit more, especially with this being a school of public policy. So having graduated from UC Riverside with a cooperative major, Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, Law and Society, which is essentially, I think, a good cross-section of subject matter you all deal with, it was Mayor and Professor Ron Leveridge, who was someone who I credit with being one of the key mentors for me early in my career and my life, having done an internship for him, and his advice to delay my plans that did exist then to go to law school. I'd taken the LSAT, pretty much ready to go, but something mentally told me I want to take a couple of years and go experience some other things. And I didn't quite know what that would be, but he encouraged me to apply to Rutgers to get a master's in public policy. I know it would have been here if the school was here, but it wasn't then. So I went into basically our deal was if I could get into the one-year program, I would do it because I wasn't looking for more school and debt, but it was one of the best experiences I could have asked for and have had, and it's exciting to see it here at the undergraduate level and the graduate level. From there, went to law school, Chapman University, not UCLA, but thank you. And Orange County DA's office was more of a accident, but a good one where wonderful experience, trial, and you combine that with water, which I already had a strong passion and interest in because of the complex intertwined areas with history, science, policy. And policy is a takeaway we want you all to have in mind, is a key overarching and underlying dynamic that's there for every aspect of water. It is. I truly believe that. That's why I'm dealing with policy every day, despite being the lawyer and servicing clients in the public and private sectors. So with that, I'd like to invite Les to say a few words, and then we'll kind of start running through the agenda and welcome input from you. Thank you.
So can you guys hear me? Okay, this is supposed to be fun, okay? We want to do this together is because it's symbolic. I'm a hydrogeologist. Science will eventually take some more backseat from policymakers and the legal community. Water in California was really a spectator sport. Now is a gladiator sport. Water has been fought over wars, and California, I don't want to go into it, but basically with the legislation passed in 2014 by Governor Brown, the state is stepping in, but it does not usurp your classical water rights. Some of you are coming from your family farms, and classical water rights still holds. And that creates some difficulty for the state to legislate and to enforce water rules. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So I wanted to do this with Wes because science and the legal community really needs to work together for the next 40 years to achieve sustainability, not only in just water, it's also for natural resources We cannot live the way we were in managing our water resources and resources. We're a very long state. We have very diverse resources up and down the state, and we need to share them. And the science community will absolutely work with the policymakers and also the legal community, because we now have extremely advanced technology to look at the earth and look at locally what we have in natural resources. So I wanted to do this with Wes, and that's why I'm here. Otherwise, I didn't want to do this.
Thanks, Les, and very mutual, and I think the symbolism is spot on, because the 40 years that Les is referring to, it relates to a lot of what's now happening with surface water challenges. Lawsuits were just filed last week, the groundwater issues. But it's advice and counseling that I constantly give is, I'm only as good as having the science and the information to fit in a set of theoretical, academic, policy-driven legal frameworks. You need the data, you need the information to do the analysis and see what is the best legal regulatory path to travel. So with that, what's our agenda? Water use in California. This is going to be kind of big picture stuff. And I think a key takeaway that we would encourage you to walk away from with this afternoon is status quo cannot remain. There's too many changes happening with Mother Nature, with the regulatory climate, federally, statewide, locally. But it's good to have a big picture working knowledge of water use in California. Water rights and regulatory processes, of course, I'll touch on that a little bit to really build up to about today's and tomorrow's climate, regulatory-wise and climatologically. We're not here to debate about climate change happening or not happening, contributions or causation from human uses. Quite often when I have to stand at podiums like this, that's kind of my disclaimer, and I'm just the lawyer to talk about how this impacts water users, whether an individual, a public agency, a nonprofit habitat preservation group, agricultural interests, you name it. So with that, we'll talk about precipitation and drought. Reservoirs, WQCP is an acronym for the Water Quality Control Plan that our State Water Resources Control Board currently has underway as a regulatory proceeding. It's called an update. That might sound rather benign, but in my mind, that is the single biggest proceeding taking place in the state of California right now that impacts water users everywhere. There's also groundwater and SIGMA, which I think is Latin for sum, so SUM. Ironically, the sum of water. That's the goal of SIGMA. Figure out how much water is in that basin and allocate it. Finance. Can't do water without having the money and the finance to get projects done and other things. Your roles. You're the future leaders. Up here, we've identified a number of different things, but I truly believe policy underlies and intertwines with each one of these things. So there is a role for everyone, whether to lead in research, to lead in a dispute resolution process to figure out solutions, or when you have to, you go to court. Examples of new water. We'll talk about that because that's a great way to try to supplement and augment a diminishing supply with increasing population demands. Les found this. This is great. Let's not look in the rearview mirror. Let's look ahead to our generations, future generations, locally, statewide, nationally, globally. So the idea here is we have what we have, whatever that is. Let's assess that, fix problems, and move forward. Water use in California. So this illustration on the left, I like to think of it as kind of an elegant system of complex systems. You have the Central Valley Project, which is a federally owned and operated project that was born more or less in the 1930s. You have the State Water Project, which is a California owned and operated system that delivers much of the water that is consumed here in Southern California. That was born essentially in the 1960s by the other Governor Brown. And then you have other systems, Les deals with SFPUC, with Hetch Hetchy, originating in Yosemite. You have Metropolitan Water District down here with its California Aqueduct. Fascinating how this all intertwines and gets water from point A to point B, hundreds of miles apart. How is that water allocated or divided or really used? Quite often you hear agricultural interests picked on or highlighted in the media. They're using 80% of the water. Well, let's look at what the data really shows. About 50% is for environmental interests, whether that's a voluntary program, a court-mandated program, some regulatory agency requires that water be in streams for fish, for riparian habitats, whatever that environmental need or interest might be. Of the remaining approximate 50%, about 41% is used for agricultural purposes, which as the 5th largest economy in the world, you could see a correlation there. The remaining 10% is for what we do every day, urban use, the commercial or industry or industrial use with a power plant, whatever the actual use might be, is only 10%, but it's significant, hence all of our conservation efforts over the past several years. California water rights. There's no way I could sum this up in one slide. But what I would say is that what makes us unique in the country is that we have a hybrid system that takes riparian and overlying rights, and I'll do a quick little primer on that, and also uses that doctrine with what's called the appropriative doctrine. And really the key point I want to make here is you can have a water right, which is what this first bullet point refers to, or you can have a contract or supply agreement between public agencies, private interests, and I think of that as more as a right to water rather than a water right. It's splitting hairs for today's purposes, but good to kind of have in mind when thinking about access and rights to water. Water is treated like real property, just like what this building is sitting on. It runs with the land, it stays with the land for the most part. It's what law school professors in the first year of real property call the bundle of sticks. It's tangible, you can see it, you can touch it. If it's poor quality, you might be able to smell it. But it's something that you can see right in front of you. It's what's called the usufructuary right. Took me a little while to be able to pronounce that without stumbling. That's the right to possess and use water. No one owns the actual molecule of water that's in this bottle or anywhere else around. It's about having the access to use it. And even then, the right is limited by two very distinct legal terms, reasonable and beneficial use. Reasonable, boy, that's a moving target with diminishing supplies, conservation mandates that the legislature has now imposed. What is a reasonable use of water? That's a big question mark. Beneficial use, there's a lot of things that are enumerated within California regulations for domestic irrigation, habitat needs. Some huge policy issues right here. 1928, our California Constitution was amended, and it's a beautiful paragraph that essentially says, maximize efficient use of water, putting it to its best uses. That's almost a 100-year-old state policy that we know to be truer now. I don't want to say than ever before, because there's always been disputes, but it's so true now with the way our population grows and the different competing interests and pressures. Public trust doctrine. This was born by Professor Joe Sachs back in the 60s, basically talking about how the public has a right to the natural resources. So these are competing policies. How do we make this work? It's all part of the challenges we deal with, and some of you do or will deal with. So quickly on riparian and overlying rights. You could picture, the stream running down and a parcel of land. This is where you're getting into real property law or real estate issues. And that parcel that is adjacent to the stream or waterway is a riparian parcel, which means that owner or occupant can utilize, with reasonable and beneficial use, water diversions for riparian use on that property, whether for a home, for cattle, for crops, a number of different uses. Overlying is treated analogously under the law, which means a basin that might sit below us, and there are basins here in Southern California, Riverside included, is that right to also be able to access and use on the land that's overlying the basin. So they're treated as one and the same for the most part. Rising from land ownership. It's unique when compared to appropriative rights, which I'm going to turn to next. By not using it, by conservation or just not having a need, that owner does not lose the right. In contrast to appropriative rights, which is that race, first in time, first in right. I've been involved in a project where competing applications getting filed at the State Water Board. Who's going to get there first? Whoever's there first is the first in line. This is real and exists still today. This was born more from the 49er 49ers era, not football, but mining, of having to get that water from point A to point B. And so these are where you have competing water right issues, and how do you resolve these things? I just want to draw a bright line in the sand about 1914. That's when our legislature enacted this Water Commission Act. It makes a massive difference for someone like me when trying to evaluate water supplies, water rights, and the different regulatory processes to navigate through. Water uses, very important. Just wanted to flag a few things, and in the interest of time, I want to move quickly just to this last bullet, because this is a major policy issue. Our legislature, just in the last session, had a bill that didn't make it all the way through, but the idea was to create another beneficial use for groundwater storage, which would mean in this world of Sigma, which you're going to hear Les providing great stuff about, is you can put water into the basin, store it, later extract it. That's good for Mother Nature. Let the levels come up. It's good for users to have extra supplies. It offsets water quality problems, you name it. But for a number of different reasons, it didn't pass, but it's an important policy issue that I would predict is going to come back again and again and finally get there. I think it will. It just wasn't ready yet. But that's huge. So let's get a new beneficial use. It'll help avoid having people like me have to go and get involved in a long, costly, uncertain legal dispute. Regulatory framework. Then I'm going to turn it over to Les. So as I was just saying, water supply source makes a big difference as to which way you navigate through regulations and make sure that the water user has a right, it's defensible, they're reporting, they're doing what they need to do. Generally, surface water streams or subterranean streams, which are like underground rivers, you go to the State Water Board. Groundwater, before 2015 with Sigma, was really just user use it. And that's what led to Sigma, and you'll hear a lot more about that. That sounds like a real bright line in the sand, but it's not. There's interconnectivity throughout many areas of the state between groundwater and surface water, which makes it very complex from the science side, and even just as complex on the legal side as to, am I going to the State Water Board, or am I going to that local agency, or am I going to both? These are the challenges that lie ahead. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Les.
Thanks. So I took this picture when I was up in the project area. So I'm a consultant to the city of San Francisco. My project area is Hetch Hetchy Reservoir and the Hetch Hetchy water system. As you may know, in the Bay Area, 2.8 million people, the Hetch Hetchy snowpack delivers water to 2.8 million people. And so after work one day, I just came up to Yosemite National Park. And in 2016, you can see there are brown trees. The trees are dying. The trees lack of water, and if they're not dying because of thirst, they're dying because of the beetles. So climate change is not a host. So scientists are already dealing with it. This is Lake Oroville, the largest reservoir in California. So it's no longer this picture, but as Wes said, 55% of our water from reservoirs are being used for industrial and drinking water. But the issue is, and I'll get into it, agriculture can not often use expensive water from reservoirs. Agriculture needs to look at using groundwater. They've always been using groundwater. It's the cheapest water, and we'll go into that in a minute. So let's start with precipitation. This is pretty poignant. Since 1922, we are already seeing a dry spell. Okay, it has to do with just nature. Whether it has to do with global warming, it doesn't matter for this session. But you can see, which is called the cumulative departure from the average. Meaning, if you add up all the rainfalls and have a running boxcar, and the average is 0, you can see we are not accumulating precipitation. And until 1983 was a very wet year. So now we are going through another one of these cycles. Starting in 2013, we are seeing another one of these cycles. And we are very concerned. Why? Because we want to use groundwater. Groundwater is drought-proof, and I'll show you that in a minute. So these are basically rain gauges in different parts of California. And most of the agriculture area, and also since 2013, they are these lines. They did not achieve a whole lot of rain in the since 1982, and so before that and after that, we're seeing these lack of precipitation. So geographically, what we're seeing is that we have exceptional drought risk in these very red areas, and coincidentally, these red areas are where we grow food. It's very important that we grow food. We are the 5th largest economy in the world, as Wes said, and 50% of our drinking water is 90% of our drinking water is being used for agriculture, and that's 55% of all water. So this is from the satellite. It's called the GRACE satellite. Raise your hand if you've heard of this. Okay. Basically, it's basically 2 satellites following each other and measuring microgravity. So you can see in 2002 to 2004, we are in trouble. We have loss of storage, and let me explain. Again, we want to use groundwater to grow food. If we lose groundwater storage, it's very hard to recover. And in fact, some of these areas in the lower San Joaquin, they would not recover because of subsidence. Groundwater subsidence, it's a loss of storage permanently. It doesn't bounce back. It's not like a sponge. So I'm going to let Wes talk about this. This is also very important because we want to store water in the surface reservoirs.
Thanks. So here we are with reservoirs. It's hard to see some of the data up here on the right side. I'll touch on that in a moment. But on this first broad bullet point with some sub-bullet points, the idea there is that, just for background and context, most of our water storage is occurring by surface reservoirs. And going back to one of those earlier charts and illustrations I had, a good number of them are in Northern California. There's some great ones. Metropolitan has Diamond Valley Lake, not too far from here. Massive project that they built relatively recently, 10 or 15 years ago. But most of it's surface. And there's another project that's getting underway up north, about an hour north of Sacramento, and that's the Sites Reservoir Project. And it's off stream, which is designed, or at least it's conceptually designed to help mitigate or reduce the environmental impacts that often dams can create for fisheries. So therein lies the challenge, is competing uses. You build a new reservoir, what are the implications to other water users, including fisheries and habitat, the environment in general? So it's challenging, which brings it back to, let's go to groundwater. If there's already been subsidence and those clay layers, see scientists teach lawyers things, have collapsed and it can't bounce back up, let's try to avoid that. Let's get the water in there sooner rather than later. It's not that easy. Policy-wise, we need to get our electeds there. I do want to touch on this, but first, up here is a statistic that says 38% of water use is groundwater, with the remainder of about 62% being surface water. That fluctuates. During the drought years, we had our historic drought of about 5 years that just recently ended. It doesn't fully flop, but it gets pretty close. That reliance on groundwater becomes greater when there's less snow, less rain, less water in the streams to be able to divert from. Back to what I said earlier, the biggest regulatory proceeding taking place in the state right now, 6 lawsuits were filed over the last 2 weeks. December 12th, our state water board adopted a document that basically calls for 40% of stream water within the San Joaquin watershed to remain in the stream 6 months of the year, January, approximately February through June, I think it is, rather, for fisheries. Right or wrong? That's for others to decide, but that's happening. That is a massive implication to water users and interest, irrigation districts, municipalities, et cetera. Are there other techniques? I want to touch quickly on this. This is what fishery biologists talk about is cold water pool techniques. I live near Folsom Lake, right up here. Reclamation, the Federal Bureau of Reclamation operates that. They have what are called shutters. They release cold water from deep down in the lake that gets into the Lower American River. It helps listed species under the Endangered Species Act. That's a great technique. So are there other models? Just that's food for thought. What it all comes down to is scientific methodologies. Go 40% or cold water techniques or something else, some combination. Then how does that fit in the legal framework? Intertwined, all of the policy issues. Less.
My favorite topic, groundwater. Groundwater is still the cheapest water, so we need to conserve as much as we can of groundwater. That means we need to store groundwater and we need to use it wisely, i.e., we need to grow valued crops. We do not need to grow crops that are of low value and use our groundwater. So, groundwater extraction is essentially, as Wes said, first come, first serve. Okay, so it's kind of a tragedy of the commons, because when you have first 1914 rights, you're going to use all the water you want. Nobody can touch you. Well, that's got to change. Okay, pumping was limited mostly to by economics. Yes, drilling deeper wells now and costs energy to pump, but that is not really a burden in most part. The burden is we just don't have enough groundwater. Surface water shortage and increased groundwater dependence. Yes, we are looking at overdrafts, and I'll explain more of that in a minute. We have rapidly declining groundwater storage, and if there is subsidence, those storage will not come back. We permanently lost it. So we're looking at deeper groundwater levels, but deeper groundwater is often poorer quality. Deeper groundwater are older water, and it often have more mineral content. And then you have land subsidence. So here is the most important slide. So you can see 80% of groundwater use is for industrial and drinking. 80% is for agriculture, and 20%, as Wes mentioned, is for other uses, urban, such as. Well, if you look at this column here, the average precipitation of each of these years, and I apologize, I don't have the latest data from DWR. I think I have it, but I'm not showing it here. So you can see some of the wet years, 2006, 2005, groundwater use is actually lessened because there are more moisture in the surface, and for agriculture, we can use more surface water, such as streams, rivers, and perhaps even local impoundments. So what we're doing now is that we are looking at years like 2009 and 2008. We have 8 years of prolonged drought. And if we have this kind of prolonged drought, agriculture use is going to be more than 80%. So for drinking water use, for example, at your house, if you're conserving 20% of your household drinking water, you're actually conserving 20% of 20%. So in other words, agriculture use is vital for the state. Total groundwater, this is thousands acre feet. So these are the absolute numbers. So this is 5 million acre feet. And so these are just some of the statistics that for these years. And you can see agriculture use averages 100 million acre feet of water in these years. You guys have any questions? This is a slide to remember. Go ahead.
A little while ago, you mentioned value crops.
Mm-hmm.
Could you define that more specifically?
Mm-hmm.
Investing in value crops, do you mean crops that produce more economic benefits or use less groundwater? I just wanted
First of all, economic benefits. We want to keep jobs. Jobs are very important, okay? We want to make sure that everybody in the Central Valley are gainfully employed. So high-value crops are like that. Low-value crops are such as alfalfa. Well, alfalfa get exported to China for feed, and those represent some low-value crops. And we are looking at water scarcity. So if we have plenty of water, no issues. Go ahead.
I was curious about when reservoirs is declining, how much of that is that impact?
Okay, I can give you a guess. I think agriculture plays not much, maybe even 20% to 25%. Maddie may actually know more. Yeah. Yes, it is off balance.
So, and if I can interject, because I thought that was great, my friend made a policy judgment there about value crops. So a question that I would want to present is that good public policy for legislators and electeds to be telling property owners, basically farmers, what crops they can grow and what they can't grow? So, and I'll just leave that rhetorically for now, but if you want to take a shot at it, you're welcome to, otherwise.
I'm not going to take a shot at it,
Okay.
but I think because we have water scarcity, we need to look at what we grow. That's all I'm saying.
By high value, do you mean high price or high social value?
Both. We want jobs. We want to.
No, but is
also-
alfalfa a low? My understanding was that alfalfa is grown because
It's pretty, yeah.
lucrative.
But it's also very water consumptive, and that's why it offsets the balance. And I apologize, I didn't explain that well.
So, I guess like urban gardening is considered kind of like a little solution to this. So like, would urban gardening also use groundwater, or would it use those traditional like municipal sources?
It's municipal sources mostly.
And is that like for now, or is that moving forward? Is that
Moving forward, it's still going to be part of urban and industrial use, unless you have a very large campus in an area where you have water rights. Then you have a school that can have urban farms, for example, and use groundwater. And so.
Yeah, and I would just add, being here in Southern California, Metropolitan Water District does have a turf rebate program, rain barrel programs. There's other localized water districts that provide that are specifically for trying to do an urban garden, as well as offset that municipal use. But so if that's not available, then it would be municipal use.
I think we should let the speakers complete their presentation and then take the questions.
Okay, otherwise I do welcome interactions. So now we get into SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. That's where us hydrogeologists are working mostly. It's Groundwater Management Act. So Governor Jerry Brown basically said, we got to manage these groundwater. Not so much the reservoir, not so much surface water, but it's groundwater. But when you think of it, it's really conjunctive use. Groundwater is being stored at the manual releases or scheduled releases of reservoir water going into rivers, and the river recharges the groundwater. So it's all very interconnected. So the SGMA Act basically says that some of these groundwater basins needs to have a plan, which is called the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. And those are for what the state now classified as high priority and also critically overdrafted. So if you can see this map here, most of where you guys are, and in Southern California, has red boundaries, and these are adjudicated basins. These basins already have groundwater masters, water masters. And you guys are basically there in the SGMA realm, but not Central and Northern California. Central and Northern California, now many of these state basins, and look at this one here, this is Southern San Joaquin. It's both critically overdrafted and high priority. And the state is saying, based on SGMA, all of these water agencies, and these are all water agencies mapped out, there are about 550 of them in the state. These water agencies need to come up with a plan by 2020 or 2022 And if that plan is accepted, then you have another 20 years. By 2040, you need to implement that plan to achieve sustainability. And if by 2040, sustainability is not achieved at the judgment of the state, then the state now, because of Sigma, can move to adjudication, meaning the state will step into your basin and assign water master to set rules for your groundwater pumping. So this is what many of us are working on. So what is sustainability? Well, sustainability is that we don't want chronic lowering of groundwater levels. Groundwater is like a bank. Okay, bank has assets. Okay, you should only use groundwater in a rechargeable groundwater aquifer. Rechargeable means that a bank has a checking account, and your banking account has a checking account and a savings account and the bank's asset. You should really use your checking account. But if you have employment issues, then you're going to dip into your savings account. So what's going to happen is that if you dip into your savings account for long enough, you're not going to quickly replenish it. So same thing with groundwater. If you lower your groundwater levels, i.e. your checking account, it's very hard to rebuild your savings account, which is storage. And this is where we're very concerned. And we have lots of technologies to look at those parameters. So we don't want to have significant reduction of storage. That's your savings account. And the bank's asset is basically all of California water. If we don't have any water in the state, then it's like the bank have no assets. So no checking account. So also seawater intrusion. For the coastal aquifers, that's a really big problem. The seawater is coming in, and with sea level rise in California coast in the next 20 to 50 years in an order of 1 meter, we're going to see more seawater coming into our freshwater aquifers. And also degrading of water quality. We're going to address that in the long run. Lesser water in the ground concentrates contaminants. It concentrates nitrate and salts, and we have water quality issues. Land subsidence we talked about, and lastly, surface water depletions. The state is now very concerned about fishery. It wants to increase the San Joaquin River flow by 40%. Well, the 40% has to come from somewhere. That's going to come from other water sources. And that's all because we want to make sure that we don't have any more impact on the beneficial uses of surface water. And one of those beneficial uses is aquatic uses.
Les, can I ask you something real quick? Each of these 6 things that Sigma says not to do have significant and unreasonable in there. Is there a definition that you're aware of for that phrase?
Yes. So the state has left it to local authority to define that. So you can't Google it, though it's basically the state is saying under Sigma, it's up to the local authority to govern their metrics. They can set their own metrics, but by 2020 and 2022, the state can judge whether you have a sustainable plan, and by 2040, you need to achieve that sustainability. But it is up to the local authority to establish the metrics for sustainability.
And to me, that's a policy judgment that all of these different agencies are going to make. And no doubt there will be inconsistencies, but maybe for good reasons given more localized conditions or characteristics. But those are policy judgments that these public agencies will ultimately make.
So the state now has Proposition 1, and it's going to continue to fund a lot of these projects to achieve sustainability. And all I want to tell you is that storage, again, storage is very important. Whether it is reservoirs or groundwater aquifers, we need to build more storage. Storage is basically like a spigot in our state infrastructure. Even groundwater aquifers, it's like a spigot. We can turn it on and off. We can regulate it by pumping, by sigma. So that's all I want to say is that we want to build as much storage, groundwater and surface water and river storage as quickly as possible. Why? Because of climate change. Because we are looking at more frequent droughts, and also because we're looking at more frequent storms. When you have large storms, what's going to happen? When the storms are very severe, most of the storm water goes to where? It goes into rivers and it goes into the ocean. We need to store this water. And Prop 1, 7.5 billion goes to 6 water divisions or state divisions agencies. Okay, I'm going to let Wes take over and.
Thank you. So I've already touched on the different roles that exist for all of you as the future for policymaking. Here we are in a water resource context. 20 years ago, I would think about water. I always loved history and how does this get built, but that's preserved. And it kind of evolves to where it sounds like a very niche, small area, but it's not. It's incredibly broad from all of these different parts that we've identified here, but even subject matter wise. Some of my friends and colleagues in the legal industry have similar practices or different practices. Some focus on the water rights, some focus on the infrastructure, some focus on the water quality. There's finance, there's rate setting requirements here in California that are unique to public agencies, or the investor-owned utilities like Southern California Edison have to go to the California Public Utilities Commission. There's all of these niche areas, subject matter-wise, endangered species. The list goes on and on from all these subject matter components that plug into these different roles that you could play and take leadership of. And what are some examples to try to tie this into new water? Because that really is a key. Storage is huge. That helps offset the past moving forward. But to even move further forward, it would help to really go back to that public policy that's almost 100 years old in our California Constitution, maximize use of the water. So desalination. Who here has heard of the Carlsbad Poseidon plant that went online just over 3 years ago? Great, couple hands. So the day that went online, I think it was December 14th or 15th of 2015, I was in San Francisco saying, that's a success. And there was a gentleman from the academic world who challenged me and said, why? It just came online. And I said, because it came online, it's a success. All of the politics that came together, all of the stakeholders that came together, the environmental community that came together, the regulatory agencies for the permitting, the private sector to help finance part of the $1 billion project, San Diego County Water Authority for having the foresight to try to increase its water portfolio and less reliance on metropolitan water. It's about 7% of their portfolio, but that's, I think, significant. So there's projects out there, and that's a huge one. There's other ones. Orange County has one or two in the mix. Others are likely to happen. Southern California Edison's been doing it at Catalina Island for probably 30 or 40 years. Stormwater, that's a massive topic where legislation needs to catch up a little bit, but there's great pilot projects going on. Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is taking leadership, working with sanitation districts, also to do recycling. I'm a huge, huge fan of a water transfer, water market. Think about it like, for those into fashion, there's a wholesaler, there's a retailer. Someone's manufacturing and then distributing clothes to retailers who then sell it to end users. It's similar for water and how it works now. That's what Metropolitan Water does for the local districts around Southern California. It's a wholesaler who you pay your bill to as your retailer. But to have transfers in market, especially in this groundwater context, is critical to allow a nimbleness. But to make it work so that you're not hurting other users, including environmental interests, the key is to try to keep it within its area of origin. That's a legal term of art, federally and state-wise. And that's critical to try to keep it where it originates. It gets used, part of it gets recharged back into the basin. That's a potential win-win situation. So I touched on this already about Carlsbad. Stormwater, I'd like to touch on something that Les has indicated a couple of times about water washing out. So often in our industry, we hear about water washing out under the Golden Gate Bridge, and that's a reality. A lot of water originates in Northern California. About 2/3 of our surface supplies originate in Northern, but 2/3 approximately are needed down here in Southern. Meanwhile, there's environmental requirements, but flood control this time of year. That Folsom Lake Reservoir might be spilling right now because there's been snow and rain, and they have to release water once a certain level is met. And if there are not needs to be drawing that by the local water users or the farms south of there, it's washing out to the delta and then underneath, literally, the Golden Gate Bridge to the ocean. So to Les's point, it gets into let's capture and reuse it, whether storing it, it's been recycled, do something other than just allowing necessary flood control to protect people. Let's capture it so we don't have this conflicting paradigm. Water markets I've touched on. One last point though, there's a lot of great conceptual ideas being developed out there. There are some public benefit corporations that have formed to try to utilize and create knowing transacting parties, a willing buyer, a willing seller. It's almost like the different realtor websites that are out there. Identify who's willing to do a water transaction, whether on a temporary basis as a lease or more permanent basis as a sale. And there are regulatory implications, but the idea is bring together willing parties so that they can make a voluntary arrangement to meet their needs. To Les for some fun philosophical challenges and then a great example.
Well, this is
We'll
the
open it up for
challenges,
questions.
this is the fun part and the challenge. We always need to think about some other ways of doing things. So thinking out of the box, I'm a hydrogeologist, so I don't think about too much about policy, but as I do my projects and I'm very pro-ag, growing food is very important. We need to think about the intellectual approach that also emphasizes empathy. We want to make sure that we are not looking out for ourselves only because our water right's there and we're going to pump the water, because if we don't pump the water in my farm, I'm going to lose the water rights. Well, we need to think about others. There's a concept called abductive reasoning, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and then also rapid prototyping, such as building small cisterns to store water and aquifers that we can store water locally. But abductive thinking instead of deductive thinking is basically think about something, anything, and write a memo, and without a whole lot of observations, because that's just the beginning, and proceeds to the simplest and the likeliest possible explanation of something. You need to explain what is going on and then define the problem. And also, by just writing a memo, abductive thinking, you're just going on a whim. You have no conclusions. You're just thinking seawater intrusion or sea level rise is going to be very damaging to my community. And that's the start of it. So with that kind of thinking, then we go into adaptive management and mitigation. We know sea level is rising, and therefore we need to be sustainable. So we think about solutions that are sustainable, meaning it's the triple bottom line, it's the technical, the cultural, and the economical feasible solutions. So the best mitigative measures based on incomplete data. If you have a problem, do something. You guys are going to be future policymakers and scientists. If you have a problem, do something. It's hard to convince your legislators or your champions of doing something, but do something based on incomplete data. Climate change is always going to be very elusive in coming to conclusion. Our data and our models of global climates are very inconclusive, but they will get better. We will have more accurate information to predict climate change. because of satellite imagery and so on. So by doing something, we can build better and better models with better and better data. And then data becomes available, then adaptive management technical solutions, meaning what you're going to build mechanically. For example, sea level rise. It's going to inundate your sanitary systems and your water system. And it's salt water. It's going to corrode. So you need to do something now because we are running out of time. But doing something with virtually no information, well, by starting that, you will do better and better, and that's what it's called adaptive management. And it's real. The city of Honolulu, city of San Francisco, they're all doing it. So here's one example that I can share with you. So I was the project manager for the city of San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. So this is one project that started with abductive reasoning, meaning we want to store groundwater locally and use it locally. So it started in 1995, and it's still being built. So these projects takes many, many years, and it's hundreds of millions of dollars. So what they want to do is basically what they call in lieu recharge, meaning it uses virtually no energy, meaning we want to store surface water by not pumping, injecting water, surface water into the ground. We want to pump less groundwater and let nature replenish the aquifer. It's a very green project, and that's why it's called in lieu recharge. And we think that in this area, and I'll show you what that area is, we can store 75,000 acre feet of water. So 1 acre feet of water is 1 acre of land with 1 foot of water. That's the volume. So we think we can do this many years ago. So we started installing monitoring wells and production wells to collect data. And then we also then started to perform numerical models. During 1995, the model was very crude, and they're not accurate at all. But as we go through time, we actually achieved SQL argument and then EIR certification in 2013. So this is the area that I'm talking about. So that's San Francisco, and this is what we call the Southwest Side Groundwater Basin. And we think we can store 75,000 acre feet beneath Daly City, Coma, Millbrae, and South San Francisco. And that's my team. We were building water wells and all kinds. That's me. So standing up in the hill, this is the basin. You can see this depression here. This is the Southwest Side Groundwater Basin, and you can look at the city of San Francisco. And this was taken in 2008. So what's the idea? So this is the idea. There are 4 scenarios, okay? This is to prepare us for climate change, for severe droughts, and even for earthquake, and I'll explain why. So CUP means Conjunctive Use Project. Like Wes said, water transfer is vitally important to manage our water. And this is a water transfer project. So combined partners. Partners are basically cities got together and tried to work with each other to manage water. Water knows no boundary. It's all underneath 4 cities. And they're going to work together along with the city of San Francisco. So pre-CUP, meaning right now, the city of San Francisco is providing Hetchy water, that's the snowpack, of 14.5 million gallons per day to these 4 cities. And they would also, in turn, pump groundwater 6.7 MGD. So that's the current situation. But we know that in the ground, there is a big void. We can store 75,000 acre feet beneath these 4 cities. So the put year, that means these are the years that we're asking the cities to cut down on their groundwater pumping. And I already said why. If they go to 1.3 from 6.7, nature will start replenishing this aquifer. Well, we need to replace that water. So the city agrees to sell more Hetchetchee water from 14 to 19 million acre feet a day. So that's good because we have the snowpack, and it's feasible because it's all gravity flow. This increase of water does not use any more energy. Okay, so this is where we want to do. So as Wes said, new water. Are we storing 75,000 acre feet of new water? So what's happened is that we want to do cutbacks. Eventually, we can store 75,000 acre feet, and that represents 7.2 MGD of water that's new. And we can then cut back the snowpack contribution from Hetchetchee. But the city can also maintain their current pumping at 6.7. This is where we are looking at mitigating any kind of a climate scenario. If there is an earthquake, if there is if the transmissions pipelines from the Sierra Nevada to San Francisco are damaged or failed, then the system may need to cut back from 14.5 to 4.5, 4.4. But we have stored new water of 7.2 already. And also, the city can maintain their current groundwater pumping because we made an effort to store 75,000 acre feet of new water. And that's what you call water transfer. It's transferring more snowpack water into these cities so that we can replenish the aquifer. That's a green project, but we are also generating new water. So what does it look like? In the yellow area, this is 75,000 acre feet of new water, possibly. So this is a big void beneath Daly City all the way down to Millbrae, from north to south. Right now, the water level is the green line, okay? It's 100 feet below sea level. So we have a big void in this aquifer. We want to bring it up to the blue line, which is the original water level in the 1800s. We want to bring it back up. But we don't want to bring it back up by injecting water and costing more energy. So we are transferring more snowpack water for consumption and let nature start to replenish, going from the green line to the blue line. So from the green line to the blue line represents 75,000 acre feet of water that can be stored, and it's new water. And also, when it's done, some of the lake levels, Lake Merced, will start to rise again, because right now Lake Merced is leaking in the groundwater, and that needs to be mitigated. So that's the technical stuff that I want to tell you. It's time to
Questions.
entertain questions. Hi.
Yes.
You know, I think you've done a wonderful job talking about groundwater and agriculture and various things, but this UCR is in a sweet spot of the Santa Ana watershed, which, you know, is one of the most populated watersheds in California. 15% of the state's population lives in the Santa Ana watershed, from the San Bernardino Mountains all the way down to Huntington Beach. And so I just wouldn't want people to leave here to think that the Santa Ana watershed does not get 2/3 of its water, you know, from groundwater. I mean, we are huge groundwater users, and we share it and we work together. Just one other thing I did want to say, because I've heard this, you know, I mean, it was necessary when the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was, you know, negotiations were going on. Adjudicated basins had to, for political reasons, be exempted. But adjudication does not necessarily mean sustainability. It meant at a certain point in time, a court decided how the parties would split the water. The San Bernardino Basin area, where, you know, UCR, City of Riverside, Riverside Public Utilities District, Western Municipal Water District. You know, you know, our basins are lower now than they were 60-some years ago when they were adjudicated. We're literally 4 inches below triggering, you know, depth levels that have never been reached since we were formed, when we were considered overdrafted. So adjudication doesn't necessarily mean
Absolutely.
sustainability. And there are efforts going on across the state for adjudicated basins to establish voluntary groundwater management councils, so that we do exactly what you said, so that when wet water is available, we're recharging our basins to the maximum extent possible. Most of our water from Northern California in the Santa Ana watershed does not go to a treatment plant. It goes into groundwater basins. It's important for place.
Right.
This is a unique place.
Well, those
It's a groundwater place, and it's not a.
those are excellent comments, and I think there's a lot there. But just to kind of try to unpack a little bit of that, you know, about adjudicated basins, I've been in several. I mean, there's now a new one in Ventura, relatively new. There's going to be more of them, and Les, I think, was focused most on Central Valley because that's really, and Central Coast is where we're going to see a lot of that. But to the point of the first comment being about being in a unique, good spot, I think you might have said safe zone. I would, oh, okay. Okay, sweet spot. Okay, thank you. Because I don't think any area is truly safe. I mean, it's just with the regulations, with the changes, different local policies that could be made, there's always moving targets. So I think with the adjudicated basins, to your comment, what's clear is whenever there's an adjudication underway, the idea is to get to a point where there's a judgment with what's called a physical solution, and the court will forever have jurisdiction. It might not be that same judge 5, 10, 20, 50 years later. The Los Angeles basins from the 60s, there's been litigation over that. There might have to be here, or at least voluntary efforts for the ones getting underway or the ones that will get underway. Absolutely, I agree with you as a purist that there needs to be not just this allocation that's consistent with water rights, but truly a solution that gets the basin to a healthy point, because that's what the law requires, and 2, that's what gives the users the best assurance that they'll have reliability well into the future. And then on the economic side, for their property transactions and sales, and then urban development, whatever it might be. So thank you. Those were very helpful comments.
Technically, I just think that the silver bullet is desalination. I think soon the technology will get to a point where we can afford it for a lot of users. It's very expensive. So groundwater could be $7 an acre feet. Reservoir water can be $700 an acre feet. Desal water is $7,000 an acre feet. So we've got to cut down the energy consumption of desalination, and we will. And their energy sources. And from a technical standpoint, I think the Santa Ana, and you guys are already doing it in Orange County, those kind of technology will come into play.
You mentioned energy, and you alluded to it a couple of times as a concern. And I remember being shocked a few years ago when I learned what the percentage of the state's energy usage is for pumping water. And I was just wondering if you had an update.
Somewhere in my computer. Yeah. It's a big percentage. Right. I heard, oh God, I heard it once. It's a big percentage. Yeah, because of the, right, because of the aqueduct system, and we have to pump water uphill and that kind of thing.
Well, and it's either going to be on the California Department of Water Resources website or the California Energy Commission's website, because it's moving with the State Water Project and Lake Oroville being the most northern reservoir that the state owns and operates to move water very far south. Getting over the Tehachapi's, who's seen on the 5 before you go over the Grapevine, the massive pipes. I mean, just the energy required to pump that water. Right. But you're highlighting, and Les brought this out, and you're highlighting in here, is the energy water nexus is a huge, huge part of the dialogue. Yes.
I have a question regarding the SIGMA policy. Particular to this region, there's a lot of communities in the low desert that Yet the golf courses out there
I
stay
know.
very green.
Yeah.
I'm wondering with local municipalities being able to sort of regulate the new Sigma policy, will that help to protect those communities or further hinder them?
That is an excellent policy question. That first thing coming to mind is our new governor, Governor Newsom, made a surprise visit last week, I think it was, to the city of Ceres in the San Joaquin
Ceres,
Valley,
yeah.
Stanislaus County, I think, in particular. And I think he's highlighted that I think the statistic is approximately 300,000 residents of California are in disadvantaged or challenged communities not having that access to safe water supplies. So I think from a state policy perspective, that's going to be one of the governor's priorities. How the local groundwater sustainability agencies deal with that, with Sigma implementation, they're going to have to make those policy judgments. There's grant money there to help clean up dirty water, number one. But then you get into, like Les's slides say, you can't usurp or get around or change the water rights. So that's where water rights holders are going to have to make business judgment decisions as to whether or not they're willing to agree to an allocation, even if increased social value, or is it too much of an infringement from their perspective that they need to raise a dispute? So you're highlighting a topic that I think we'll see a lot more of in 2019 and a lot this year.
If I may add, to further humanize it, you've done a really good job. It's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart because I'm very pro-ag. And I'm seeing a lot of communities in the Salinas Valley, disadvantaged communities, they're lacking high quality water because there's lack of it. And now salt and nitrate are concentrating in the groundwater. And some of these communities cannot drink their groundwater. They need to be provided with bottled water. So the state does provide grants. And if you're a disadvantaged community, you do not have to have matching funds. Okay, if you're a disadvantaged community, you can apply for state grants and they will give you the money. You don't have to match it as compared to a non-disadvantaged community or non-economically depressed community. So you need to have champions. Again, you need to have champions, people, to champion these projects.
So y'all mentioned that there's two different institutions responsible for surface water and groundwater, but there's huge intersectionality amongst surface water and groundwater. So do you see a need, or do you think it'd be better if that was consolidated to see a more holistic approach to how we look at these issues?
I like that question. And I struggle to try to answer it effectively because law and regulatory processes have only caught up to what scientists have known for decades, if not longer. Interconnectivity exists. There was actually just a Court of Appeal opinion that came out last year that speaks to the interconnectivity that now in a Sigma context has people like me busy having to think about how that works and then coordinate with people like Les. How do we get to a plan in the groundwater context to make it work? I think I'd be troubled if the regulatory agencies kind of collapsed and did that. But I think that's more of a regulatory implication. I think the way it's set up now is it is being treated holistically. I would just say that it's, whether it just caught up or finally caught up, it's in the eyes of the beholder. But it is holistic because Sigma in that sixth, what we'll call a deadly sin, it's the wrong thing to do, is to ignore the interconnectivity.
I do believe in balance of power. Just like our federal government, we need to have a check and balances. So our California Department of Fish and Wildlife, they really look at the health of our aquatic system, and we need that to balance out how much water we're going to be using or diverting from our streams. We dammed up just about every river in California.
Thank you very much. We can have one more question, but in the interest of time, we need to move on. Great discussion. Anybody else have a question?
Wasn't there a whole issue with salt, with the salt afterwards? Was there any kind of update on terms of, and you guys seem very optimistic about it, it's not just kind of
Yeah.
to
want to address the technical?
Okay, so you guys did very well in Southern California. You have brine lines that, when they're desalters, I think in Sapa, in the Santa Ana watershed, you guys have, I think, 3 desalters, and you have a brine line that goes into to the Pacific Ocean. Well, you need those brine lines because you cannot, salt is conserved. You cannot get rid of it chemically. So it needs to go back into the ocean. So that's a big problem. And to mitigate that, there are countries in the world who has these diffuser depositing salt back into the ocean, and these diffusers are like 3 miles long, so that it would not disturb local fisheries, because these are very, very salty water that's being deposited back into the ocean.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.